Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that'll make your worst pandemic fears look like a mild inconvenience. We're talking about life in a medieval city during the Black Death, when 1/3 of Europe's population simply vanished in the span of a few years. You think you had it rough during COVID lockdowns? You think wearing a mask was the end of civilization? Well, buckle up, because we're about to explore what it was really like when the Grim Reaper decided to take a European vacation and brought his entire extended family along for the ride. Most people imagine the plague as this distant, almost romantic historical tragedy, something out of a Monty Python sketch with people dramatically crying, "Bring out your dead." But the reality was far more horrific than any Hollywood depiction could capture. We're talking about cities where the living envied the dead, where the smell of rotting corpses became as normal as morning coffee, and where your chances of seeing tomorrow were about as good as winning the lottery. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially when we're about to dive into humanity's darkest chapters. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because trust me, after tonight, you'll never complain about a traffic jam or a long line at the grocery store ever again. You're approaching the city gates of Florence in the year 1348, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smell. Imagine the worst garbage dump you've ever encountered. Multiply that by 1,000. Then add the sweet, sickly stench of human decay baking under the Mediterranean sun. That's your welcome mat to one of Europe's greatest cities during the height of the Black Death. The very air seems thick with death, clinging to your clothes, seeping into your pores, becoming part of you whether you want it or not. The guards at the gate don't even bother checking who you are anymore. Half of them are dead, and the other half are too busy trying not to breathe through their noses to care about customs or documentation. You notice one guard has tied a cloth soaked in vinegar around his face, a medieval gas mask that's about as effective as using a screen door on a submarine. The vinegar burns his eyes and makes him tear up constantly, but he's convinced it's filtering out the bad air that supposedly carries the plague. He waves you through with barely a glance, probably figuring you'll be dead within a week anyway. So why waste the energy on paperwork that nobody will ever read? As you step through those ancient stone archways, you're entering what essentially amounts to an open-air morgue masquerading as a functioning city. The cobblestone streets, once bustling with merchants hawking their wares and children playing games, now serve as obstacle courses lined with human corpses. You have to literally step over bodies to make your way down what used to be the main thoroughfare. Some of these corpses have been here so long they've become part of the street furniture, dried, mummified remains that crunch underfoot like autumn leaves. Except these leaves used to be people with names and families and dreams. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Some of these bodies aren't even dead yet. You see a woman propped against a building wall, black swellings the size of apples bulging from her neck and armpits. Her eyes follow your movement, but she can't speak anymore. The plague has progressed to the point where her throat is so swollen that breathing itself has become a Herculean task. In your time, she'd be in intensive care with round-the-clock medical attention, ventilators, antibiotics, pain management. Here, she's just another Tuesday afternoon casualty waiting for death to finish its paperwork. The few people still moving through the streets avoid eye contact like it's a capital offense. Everyone's become an expert in peripheral vision, because looking directly at someone means acknowledging they're still alive, which means you might have to help them. And helping anyone in a plague city is essentially signing your own death warrant. So you walk in this bizarre dance of deliberately not seeing the suffering all around you. It's like an entire city has developed social anxiety disorder as a survival mechanism. You notice the windows of the houses are either boarded up or hanging open like dead eyes. The boarded ones might contain survivors barricading themselves in, or they might be tombs where entire families died together, and no one's bothered to clear out the bodies yet. The smell coming from some of these sealed houses suggests the latter. The open windows are usually a sign that whoever lived there fled the city, abandoning everything they couldn't carry. Smart move. Except most roads out of the city are blocked by other cities that don't want plague refugees bringing death to their doorsteps. The economic system has completely collapsed in ways that would make modern economists weep. You see a merchant's stall still set up, but the merchant is slumped over his wares, dead for who knows how long. His expensive silk fabrics are now bedding for rats, and those rats are fatter than you've ever seen rats before. There's plenty of food lying around when half the population has stopped eating permanently. These super rats are going to be a problem long after the plague passes, but right now, that's tomorrow's concern. And tomorrow is a luxury most people can't afford to think about. Church bells that once marked the hours with precision now ring sporadically, if at all. When they do ring, it's usually not for regular prayers, but for last rites. And there are so many people dying that the bells have essentially become a constant drone. The priests are dropping like flies too, because their job literally requires them to give last rites to the dying, which means getting up close and personal with plague victims right when they're most contagious. It's like being a first responder to a chemical spill, except nobody knows what chemicals they're dealing with or how to protect themselves. You pass by a house where someone has chalked a crude cross on the door. This is the medieval equivalent of a biohazard warning. It means everyone inside is either dead or dying of plague, and the authorities, what's left of them, will eventually get around to dealing with it. Eventually being the key word, because the city's entire infrastructure for handling dead bodies was designed for maybe a dozen deaths per week, not hundreds per day. The cross is starting to fade from weather and time, suggesting this house has been a death trap for longer than anyone wants to calculate. The strangest part is the silence. Florence was known for being loud. Merchants shouting prices, horses clopping on cobblestones, children laughing, dogs barking, the general buzz of human activity that defines urban life. Now the loudest sounds are your own footsteps and the occasional moan from someone dying nearby. It's like walking through a city-sized mausoleum where some of the exhibits are still technically breathing. Even the animals have gone quiet. The surviving dogs slink through shadows like furry ghosts. And the birds seem to have abandoned the city entirely, as if they can sense that this place has become fundamentally incompatible with life. The psychological impact of this environment hits you in waves. Your brain keeps trying to process what you're seeing as normal urban activity, because that's what brains do. They try to make sense of sensory input by comparing it to familiar patterns. But there are no familiar patterns here. This is so far outside normal human experience that your mind starts playing tricks on you, making you see movement in corpses, hear voices in the wind, smell familiar scents in the miasma of decay. The perfume of the apocalypse. You've been in the city for 2 hours now, and your nose is starting to adapt to what the locals call the perfume of mortality. This isn't just a poetic phrase. It's a very real phenomenon that plague survivors developed to cope with the omnipresent stench of decomposition. Human beings have this remarkable ability to become noseblind to even the most horrific smells, which in this case is literally a survival mechanism, because if you kept the same sensitivity to the odor of rotting flesh, you'd spend your entire day vomiting until you died of dehydration. But let's be clear about what you're actually smelling here. It's not just death. It's death in various stages of progression, each with its own distinct aromatic signature that would make a forensic investigator sick. Fresh corpses have that metallic, almost sweet smell of blood and recent biological shutdown, like copper pennies mixed with something floral that your brain can't quite identify. Bodies that have been dead for a few days develop that unmistakable, putrid odor that makes your stomach flip and your throat close up involuntarily. Week-old corpses smell like nothing you can compare to in your modern experience. Imagine the worst spoiled meat you've ever encountered. Then multiply it by every nightmare you've ever had about decay, and add a chemical component that burns your sinuses. The city's original waste management system was already pretty medieval, even before the plague hit, which is saying something considering we're literally in medieval times. Human waste was typically thrown out of windows into the streets, where it would flow downhill toward the river along with rainwater. Animal waste from horses, pigs, and chickens mixed with food scraps and other organic garbage to create a baseline level of urban funk that would send a modern health inspector into cardiac arrest. The smell was manageable then because it was organic waste mixed with the normal sense of urban life. Cooking food, burning wood, leather, metalwork, human activity. Now add thousands of decomposing human bodies to that mix, and you've got an olfactory apocalypse that redefines what the human nose can endure. You notice people walking around with herbs and flowers pressed against their noses. Rosemary, thyme, lavender, anything with a strong natural scent that might mask the smell of death. The wealthy ones carry elaborate pomanders, decorative containers filled with expensive spices and perfumes that cost more than most people's annual income. These aren't fashion statements. They're desperate attempts to create a small bubble of breathable air around their faces. Whether these actually help prevent disease is debatable, but they definitely help prevent psychological breakdown from the constant assault on your senses. Some people have taken to burning aromatic woods constantly, creating these surreal scenes where sweet-smelling smoke pours out of windows while bodies pile up in the streets below. The really disturbing part is how the smell changes throughout the day like some kind of macabre weather pattern. Morning brings what you might call fresh death people who died during the night and haven't had time to fully decompose yet. There's still something almost human about the smell, mixed with the sense of whatever they were wearing or lying on when they died. By afternoon, the Mediterranean heat has been working on all the corpses for hours, creating this thick, almost tangible miasma that seems to hang in the air like a plague fog. You can literally see heat waves rising from decomposing bodies, carrying with them particles of decay that you're breathing into your lungs. Evening is somehow worse, because the cooling air traps all the day's accumulated death smell close to the ground where you're breathing it. It's like the city has become a giant bowl collecting the essence of human decay and concentrating it at street level. Night doesn't provide relief either, because that's when you become most aware of the smell without the visual distractions of trying to navigate around corpses. You lie awake breathing death, tasting it on your tongue, feeling it settle into your clothes and hair until you become a walking repository of the city's mortuary atmosphere. You start to understand why medieval people believed in bad air, the theory that disease spread through foul-smelling vapors called miasma. When you're constantly surrounded by the smell of death, and when that smell coincides with more people getting sick and dying, it's a pretty logical conclusion to draw. They weren't entirely wrong, either. While plague spread through fleas on rats, not through air, the unsanitary conditions that created the horrible smells were definitely contributing to the spread of disease and making survival harder for everyone. The psychological impact of the smell is almost as devastating as the disease itself. Your brain is hardwired to associate the smell of death with danger, with the need to flee immediately. It's an evolutionary response that kept our ancestors alive by warning them away from contaminated areas, diseased animals, and dangerous situations. But when that smell is everywhere and there's nowhere to flee to, your nervous system goes into a kind of shocked shutdown. People develop this 1,000-yard stare, walking through the streets like zombies, their brains having essentially given up processing the sensory information because it's too overwhelming to handle. You notice that animals react to the smell differently than humans. Dogs and cats have mostly fled the city entirely. Their more sensitive noses couldn't handle what yours is slowly adapting to. The few remaining pets are clearly distressed, panting constantly, whimpering, trying to bury their noses in whatever clean-smelling materials they can find. The rats, on the other hand, seem completely unbothered. They're thriving in this environment, growing fat on corpses and reproducing at an alarming rate. It's like nature's way of announcing that the natural order has completely inverted. The animals that should be fleeing are staying, and the animals that should be leaving are multiplying. Even water tastes different in the city now. The wells and fountains that supply drinking water are contaminated with runoff from the streets, which means every sip carries a faint aftertaste of the carnage above ground. Wine has become the safer option, not just because alcohol kills some bacteria, but because the strong flavor masks the taste of death that seeped into everything else. People are getting drunk not for pleasure, but as a form of sensory self-defense, trying to numb their taste buds and their sense of smell enough to function in an environment that's fundamentally hostile to human senses. The Hunger Games, Medieval Edition. Your stomach is starting to growl. And that's when you realize you've stumbled into perhaps the most twisted version of supply and demand economics in human history. Food is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. There's plenty of grain in the warehouses and livestock in the fields outside the city. But good luck finding anyone alive to sell it to you, or anyone brave enough to transport it through a plague zone, or anyone trustworthy enough to handle food without contaminating it with whatever diseases they might be carrying. The few markets still operating look like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie directed by someone with a particularly dark sense of humor. Picture a handful of desperate vendors with carts of wilted vegetables, spoiled meat, and bread that's gone stale because the bakers are either dead or have fled the city. These remaining merchants wear cloth masks and maintain aggressive social distancing, about 6 feet apart, which coincidentally is both good plague prevention and the exact depth of a standard grave. The irony isn't lost on anyone who's still capable of recognizing irony in their current circumstances. You approach a bread vendor who's set up shop next to a fountain clogged with debris and probably a few floating corpses. The fountain was once a beautiful centerpiece of municipal pride, carved with religious scenes and designed to provide clean water for the community. Now it's a stagnant pool of disease that nobody bothers to clean because the city workers responsible for maintenance are either dead or have more pressing concerns, like staying alive. The bread vendor quotes you a price that would have bought you a month's worth of food before the plague hit. This isn't greed, it's survival economics. When half your customer base is dead, and the other half might be dead tomorrow, you charge whatever the market will bear. The bread itself tells a story of urban collapse that goes beyond simple supply shortages. Before the plague, Florence had guilds of bakers who took pride in their craft, using specific grades of flour and time-tested recipes passed down through generations. These artisans created different types of bread for different social classes. Fine white bread for the wealthy, coarser brown bread for the middle class, and basic black bread for the poor. Now you're looking at what's essentially hardtack, dense, barely edible chunks of baked grain designed for maximum shelf life rather than flavor or nutrition. The remaining bakers aren't artists anymore. They're survival technicians trying to create calories that won't kill you before the plague gets a chance to. Water represents an even bigger nightmare than food, because you need it every day, and there's no substitute that doesn't carry its own risks. The city's water sources were questionable even in good times, but now they're genuinely dangerous. The wells are contaminated with runoff from streets filled with human waste and decomposing bodies. The river that runs through the city has become a convenient body disposal site, which means downstream water sources are essentially liquid death. You watch locals drinking wine with every meal, including breakfast, because fermented beverages are literally safer than water. Children are getting drunk because it's the only way to safely hydrate, which creates its own set of problems, but beats dying of waterborne illness. You notice something particularly disturbing about food storage and preservation. Normally, families would preserve meat by salting it or smoking it in controlled conditions, creating food stores that could last through winter or times of scarcity. But with so many people dead, There are houses full of food just sitting there, rotting alongside their former owners. It's like a citywide exhibition of what happens when food science meets mass mortality. Entire pantries full of spoiled grain, moldy cheese, and meat that's gone so bad it's practically liquefied. The smell from these abandoned food stores adds another layer to the city's already overwhelming olfactory assault. The few livestock left in the city have become either walking plague vectors or mobile food sources, depending on your perspective and your level of desperation. Pigs are roaming the streets, feeding on human corpses, which creates this horrifying cycle where the animals people might eat are literally consuming plague victims. These pigs are getting fat on human flesh, growing larger and more aggressive than domestic pigs should be. Chickens and goats are slightly safer from a disease perspective, but they're also more likely to have fled or been eaten already by desperate survivors who couldn't wait for proper slaughter and preparation. Cooking has become a logistical nightmare that would challenge a military quartermaster. Firewood is scarce because the people who used to cut and transport it are dead, and the forests outside the city are controlled by bandits who prey on refugees and supply caravans. Coal is available but expensive, and many houses don't have proper ventilation for coal fires anyway, which means people are choosing between asphyxiation and cold meals. You see people cooking over open fires in the streets, using whatever burnable materials they can find: furniture, wooden tools, sometimes even pieces of abandoned houses. It's like the entire city has reverted to camping, except the campground is filled with corpses, and there's no park ranger to help if things go wrong. The social etiquette around food has completely disintegrated in ways that reveal how thin the veneer of civilization really is. Normally, sharing meals was a cornerstone of medieval social life. Families ate together. Neighbors shared resources during tough times. Religious communities held communal feasts that reinforced social bonds. Now, eating in public is like painting a target on your back. If people see you have food, they might try to take it. If they see you eating with others, they might assume you're part of a group worth robbing or that you have supplies worth stealing. Meals have become solitary, secretive affairs conducted behind locked doors with weapons within easy reach. You witness something that perfectly encapsulates the food situation. A wealthy merchant's house where the front door is standing open, revealing a dining room with a feast still laid out on the table. The family clearly died in the middle of a meal. Their skeletons are still seated at the table, and the food has decomposed into an abstract art piece of mold and rot. Expensive silver plates hold what used to be roasted meats, now reduced to furry lumps of decay. Wine glasses still contain liquid, but it's turned to vinegar and worse. It's like a medieval version of the Marie Celeste, except instead of mysterious disappearance, you know exactly what happened. Everyone just died faster than they could finish dinner. The psychological impact of food scarcity goes beyond simple hunger and malnutrition. When you're not sure where your next meal is coming from, or whether that meal might be contaminated with plague, or whether eating in public might get you robbed, the simple act of feeding yourself becomes a complex strategic decision. People develop obsessive behaviors around food hoarding, even when they don't have secure storage. You see survivors carrying small amounts of food with them constantly, never letting it out of their sight, because leaving food unattended is guaranteed to result in theft. Medieval medicine? How to die faster with professional help. You've developed a headache from the stress and the smell, and you're starting to feel a bit feverish. This could be early-stage plague, or just your body's natural response to being in literal hell. But either way, you decide to seek medical attention. Big mistake. Huge mistake. Medieval medicine during the Black Death makes modern anti-vaxxers look like Nobel Prize winners in comparison. And seeking professional medical help is often the fastest way to transform a minor ailment into a fatal catastrophe. You find one of the few physicians still practicing in the city, and he's exactly what you'd expect from someone who learned medicine by reading ancient Greek text translated through Arabic into Latin and has never heard of bacteria, viruses, or basic hygiene. He's wearing a long leather robe that hasn't been cleaned in months, and one of those infamous beak-shaped masks stuffed with herbs and spices. This outfit, called a plague doctor costume, was supposed to protect him from bad air, but it actually makes him look like a cross between a medieval Darth Vader and a very disturbed bird. The beak contains aromatic substances that allegedly filter poisonous air, but really just make him smell like a walking spice cabinet while providing zero actual protection against disease transmission. His diagnosis method involves examining your urine, not testing it in any scientific way, just looking at it and making educated guesses based on color, clarity, and sometimes taste. Yes, taste. Medieval physicians sometimes tasted patients' urine to detect sweetness that might indicate diabetes, though they called it different names and understood none of the underlying physiology. He holds up a small glass vial of your pee to the light, swirls it around like he's a wine sommelier evaluating a particularly challenging vintage, and pronounces that you have an excess of yellow bile caused by planetary misalignment and possibly demonic influence. This is medieval medicine in a nutshell. Wrong diagnosis based on wrong theory, leading to wrong treatment that will probably kill you faster than the disease. The treatment he prescribes is what's called bloodletting, deliberately cutting open your veins to drain what he considers to be corrupted blood. His logic is that bad blood causes disease, so removing bad blood cures disease. It's like thinking you can fix a car's engine problems by draining the oil, except cars don't have feelings and can't die from the treatment. He produces a collection of sharp instruments that look like they were designed by someone who confused surgery with medieval torture, and none of them have been cleaned since the last patient, who probably died on this very table. The tools are caked with dried blood from previous procedures, creating a perfect breeding ground for the kind of infections that turn minor medical problems into major medical disasters. But wait, it gets worse. If bloodletting doesn't work, he has other options that demonstrate the medieval medical profession's remarkable creativity in finding new ways to harm patients. There's cupping, where he heats glass cups and places them on your skin to create suction that draws blood to the surface. The theory is that this pulls the disease out of your body through your skin, but the reality is that it just creates painful bruises and open wounds that can become infected. Then there's trepanation for headaches, drilling holes in your skull with hand tools to release evil spirits or excess pressure. You know, the kind of medical procedure that makes lobotomies look sophisticated and minimally invasive. His medicine cabinet is filled with substances that range from useless to actively poisonous, most of which cost more than a working person's annual income. There's mercury, which was considered a cure-all, but actually causes heavy metal poisoning that manifests as tremors, kidney damage, and neurological problems. There's ground-up unicorn horn, which is actually narwhal tusk and does absolutely nothing except prove that medieval people were excellent at marketing imaginary products to desperate customers. There's something called theriac, a supposed universal antidote made from dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh, which was about as effective as a chocolate teapot, but far more expensive and occasionally toxic. You notice that this physician's other patients aren't exactly success stories. There's a man in the corner who came in with a minor fever and is now unconscious from blood loss after an aggressive bloodletting session that removed about a quarter of his total blood volume. There's a woman who had her bubonic swellings lanced with a dirty knife, and now has a raging infection that's spreading faster than the original plague symptoms. Medieval medicine had a remarkable talent for taking manageable conditions and turning them into fatal catastrophes through well-intentioned but completely misguided interventions. The religious component of medieval medicine makes everything even more problematic, because it introduces supernatural explanations that prevent doctors from developing effective treatments. Your physician explains that disease is ultimately God's punishment for sin, which means the most important part of treatment is spiritual rather than physical. He recommends confessing your sins, making a pilgrimage to a holy shrine, and donating money to the church. While these activities might provide psychological comfort, they're not exactly what you'd call evidence-based medicine. The focus on spiritual causes means that physicians don't bother looking for natural explanations or developing treatments based on observation and experimentation. Pain management consists of alcohol, opium if you're wealthy enough to afford imported drugs, or just gritting your teeth and praying if you're poor. Anesthesia hasn't been invented yet, so any surgical procedure is performed on fully conscious patients who are held down by strong assistants while they scream. Imagine having a tooth extracted or a limb amputated while completely awake and feeling every moment of it. Medieval surgery was less medical procedure and more endurance contest, with success measured not by medical outcomes, but by whether the patient survived the treatment long enough to heal from it. The physician shows you his reference books, hand-copied manuscripts, filled with anatomical drawings that are wildly inaccurate because they're based on animal dissections rather than human observation, since religious authorities forbade human dissection for most of the medieval period. The heart is drawn in the wrong location. The brain is depicted as having weird chambers that don't exist, and the digestive system looks like it was designed by someone who had never seen the inside of a human body. These are the medical textbooks that trained your doctor, which explains why his treatments seem designed by someone who doesn't understand basic human anatomy. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the physician's success rate and his attitude toward it. He admits that most of his patients die, but he attributes this to God's will rather than to his treatments being actively harmful. He's not malicious. He genuinely believes he's helping people using the best medical knowledge available. The fact that this best available knowledge is completely wrong doesn't occur to him, because the scientific method won't be invented for several more centuries, and the concept of testing treatments to see if they actually work is foreign to medieval medical thinking. When society goes full Lord of the Flies, you've been in Plague City for 3 days now, and you're starting to notice that all those social norms and laws that keep civilization functioning have essentially evaporated like morning dew in hell. When people know they're probably going to die within a week, long-term consequences stop being particularly motivating. And that's when you discover what human beings are really like when the social contract gets torn up and fed to the rats. It's not pretty, and it's not noble, and it definitely doesn't match any romantic notions about human nature you might have picked up from feel-good movies. The first thing you notice is that property rights have become more of a suggestion than a rule, like speed limits during a zombie apocalypse. You watch a group of survivors casually walking into abandoned houses and taking whatever they want: furniture, clothing, food, valuables, even personal items that have no practical value but might provide psychological comfort. This isn't technically looting because there's no one left to file a complaint. But it's still surreal to see people shopping through dead families' possessions like they're browsing a medieval garage sale. The line between scavenging for survival and stealing from corpses has become philosophical rather than practical. And philosophy doesn't put food in your stomach. Law enforcement has collapsed so completely that the concept itself seems quaint, like medieval people trying to enforce modern copyright law. The city guards are either dead, fled, or have decided that maintaining order in a plague zone is above their pay grade and life expectancy. The few remaining authority figures are dealing with survival logistics, managing food distribution, disposing of bodies, trying to prevent the complete breakdown of urban infrastructure. Nobody has time to investigate theft, assault, or even murder, because those crimes have become background noise in a symphony of death. When everyone's a potential victim and everyone's a potential perpetrator, traditional law enforcement becomes meaningless. You witness a fascinating example of instant social stratification that would make sociology professors weep with academic excitement if they weren't too busy being dead. A group of survivors has formed around a wealthy merchant who still has access to food stores and wine cellars. This guy has essentially become a feudal lord overnight, trading protection and resources for loyalty and service. People who were equals just months ago are now clearly divided into those who have, and those who serve those who have. It's like watching civilization rewind itself to a more primitive state in real time, complete with makeshift hierarchies based on who controls the means of survival. The really disturbing part is how quickly violence becomes normalized when normal social constraints disappear. You see two men fighting over a dead woman's jewelry, and nobody intervenes. Not because people don't care, but because intervention might mean getting involved in conflict when you need to save your energy for staying alive. Everyone's operating on the assumption that other people are potential threats, which creates this atmosphere of constant, low-level paranoia that makes everyday interactions feel like negotiating with wild animals. Trust becomes a luxury that most people can't afford, because trusting the wrong person can literally get you killed. Sexual assault and rape have become epidemic because the normal social mechanisms that prevent these crimes, community oversight, legal consequences, family protection, social shame, have all broken down along with everything else. Women are traveling in groups when they travel at all, and many have taken to disguising themselves as men or as plague victims to avoid unwanted attention. Some women smear themselves with filth and pretend to be corpses when strangers approach, which is both brilliant survival strategy and deeply horrifying social commentary. It's particularly awful because in medieval society, women already had limited rights and protections, and the plague has stripped away even those minimal safeguards. Children have become either incredibly precious or completely expendable, depending on the circumstances and the people involved. Families with resources guard their children like valuable possessions, keeping them hidden and protected at all costs, because children represent future genetic survival in a world where the future itself is uncertain. But orphan children, and there are thousands of them, are essentially feral. You see groups of kids as young as 8 or 9 running through the streets like wolf packs, stealing food, sleeping in abandoned buildings, and developing survival skills that would impress a military training instructor. These children are growing up without any adult supervision or moral guidance, which means they're learning that might makes right and that other people are either resources to be exploited or threats to be avoided. The economic system has reverted to pure barter, but with a medieval twist that would confuse modern economists. Currency still exists, but its value fluctuates wildly based on immediate utility, rather than any abstract concept of stored value. A gold coin might be worth less than a loaf of bread, because you can't eat gold, and there's nowhere safe to spend money anyway. People are trading in favors, protection, information, and immediate necessities. Sexual services have become a common form of currency, which creates its own set of moral and practical problems. It's like capitalism collapsed back into a primitive exchange system overnight, except without any of the social structures that made primitive exchange systems stable. Religious authority has splintered into competing factions with radically different interpretations of what the plague means and what people should do about it. Some priests preach that the end times are here, and everyone should prepare for final judgment by confessing sins and giving away worldly possessions. Others claim the plague is punishment for specific sins and promote increasingly extreme forms of repentance, including self-flagellation and persecution of supposed sinners. Still others have abandoned their religious duties entirely and are indulging in the same survival-focused hedonism as everyone else. When your spiritual guides can't agree on what's happening or what to do about it, moral authority becomes pretty meaningless. You observe a particularly chilling example of how social bonds disintegrate under extreme stress. A family group is arguing over whether to care for their elderly grandfather, who's showing early plague symptoms. The practical argument is that caring for him wastes resources and increases everyone's risk of infection, so they should abandon him to die alone. The emotional argument is that he's family and deserves care regardless of cost. because maintaining human connections is what separates them from animals. You watch this fundamental human dilemma play out in real time. The tension between survival pragmatism and moral obligation that defines the human condition when resources are scarce and death is imminent. Perhaps most disturbing is how quickly people adapt to the new normal, developing psychological mechanisms that allow them to function in conditions that would have driven them insane just months ago. Behaviors that would have been unthinkable in normal times. Stepping over corpses, ignoring cries for help, taking food from the dead, become routine survival techniques that people perform without conscious thought. You're witnessing the speed at which civilization is actually just a thin veneer over much more primitive instincts, and how quickly that veneer can be stripped away when circumstances become extreme enough. It's like watching a controlled experiment in social collapse, except there's nothing controlled about it, and the results are absolutely terrifying. Welcome to the Medieval Apocalypse Cult Convention. Just when you think the situation can't get more surreal, you stumble into what can only be described as religious hysteria, cranked up to 11 and then broken off at the dial. Groups of people called flagellants are marching through the streets, whipping themselves bloody while singing hymns and proclaiming that the end times have arrived. These aren't just a few religious extremists working through personal issues in public. We're talking about organized movements of hundreds of people who've decided that the appropriate response to a plague is ritualistic self-torture performed as community theater. The flagellant processions are like nothing you've ever imagined, and hopefully nothing you'll ever see again. Picture a parade where everyone is shirtless, carrying leather whips tipped with metal studs, and systematically destroying their own backs while chanting prayers in Latin they probably don't understand. They believe that by punishing themselves, they can convince God to stop punishing humanity with the plague. It's collective self-harm as a form of prayer, and it's happening on a massive scale across Europe. The sound of leather hitting flesh creates this rhythmic percussion that echoes through empty streets, like a drummer keeping time for the apocalypse while the world dies around them. These groups follow strict rituals that would make military drill sergeants proud and therapists very concerned. They march from town to town in formations, stopping at specific intervals to perform what they call the discipline, 33.5 days of organized self-flagellation, representing the years of Christ's life. They have leaders called masters who direct the whipping sessions and ensure that everyone participates with appropriate enthusiasm. It's like organized religion meets BDSM meets medieval performance art, and it's absolutely terrifying to witness. The masters carry special whips and determine when people have whipped themselves enough, which raises disturbing questions about how they measure adequate self-punishment. The psychological logic behind flagellation makes sense in a twisted medieval way that reveals how desperate people become when faced with incomprehensible catastrophe. These people believe that God sent the plague as punishment for humanity's sins. So the solution is to punish themselves harder than God is punishing them, thereby demonstrating repentance and hopefully earning divine mercy. It's like trying to outbid God in an auction where the currency is human suffering. The fact that it doesn't work, that people continue dying regardless of how much they whip themselves, doesn't seem to diminish their enthusiasm. If anything, it makes them whip themselves harder, because obviously they haven't suffered enough yet to get God's attention. But the flagellants are just one flavor of religious extremism flourishing in plague conditions, like different species of dangerous mushrooms growing in the same toxic soil. You encounter groups that have decided the plague is actually Satan's work, not God's, which means the appropriate response is demon fighting rather than self-punishment. These people spend their time performing elaborate exorcism rituals, burning anything they consider cursed or demonic, and hunting for witches and heretics to blame for the plague. It's like medieval QAnon, except instead of internet conspiracy theories, they're working with actual supernatural belief systems that encourage them to torture and murder their neighbors. Then there are the apocalyptic cults who've decided that the plague signals the imminent second coming of Christ, which means normal social rules no longer apply because the world is ending anyway. Some of these groups practice communal living, where all property is shared, all marriages are dissolved, and everyone prepares for the end of the world through prayer, fasting, and group confession sessions that would make modern therapy groups look like casual coffee dates. Others go in the opposite direction, deciding that if the world is ending, they might as well sin as much as possible before Judgment Day arrives. These sin now, repent later cults engage in orgies, theft, and violence as forms of religious expression. The Children's Crusades represent perhaps the most heartbreaking form of religious hysteria, because they involve kids who are trying to save a world that adults have completely failed to protect. Groups of orphan children, some as young as 6 or 7, have organized themselves into mini religious movements, convinced that their innocence gives them special power to stop the plague through prayer. They march through cities singing hymns and begging God to spare humanity, completely unaware that they're more likely to die of exposure or starvation than to receive divine intervention. Watching children take responsibility for saving the world from an adult catastrophe is devastating, especially when you know their efforts are futile. You witness something called a dance plague, or dancing mania, where groups of people dance frantically for hours or even days until they collapse from exhaustion. They believe that dancing will either appease God's anger or shake the plague demons out of their bodies through physical exertion. These aren't joyful celebrations, they're desperate, manic displays of religious fervor where people literally dance until they drop. Some die from exhaustion, others from dehydration. But the dancing continues because stopping means admitting that God isn't listening or that their efforts aren't working. The dancing becomes increasingly frenzied as people realize it's not helping, creating a feedback loop of desperation and physical collapse. The most disturbing aspect is how these religious movements prey on desperate people's need for meaning and control in an uncontrollable situation. When conventional religion offers no clear answers and conventional medicine offers no effective treatments, extreme religious practices provide at least the illusion of doing something meaningful. People would rather whip themselves bloody than feel helpless, would rather blame witches than accept randomness, would rather prepare for the apocalypse than admit that sometimes terrible things just happen for no reason. These movements give people agency in a situation where they have no real power, which is psychologically necessary but practically useless. These movements also serve as vectors for plague transmission, because they involve large groups of people gathering closely together, sharing food and water, and traveling from place to place. The flagellants, in particular, create open wounds that can become infected, and their group living arrangements facilitate disease spread. So not only are these religious responses ineffective against the plague, they actually make the plague worse. But that irony is lost on people who've already decided that spiritual solutions are more important than practical ones. They're literally making the problem worse while convinced they're solving it, which is perhaps the most medieval thing imaginable. You notice that many of these religious movements attract people who were already marginalized or mentally unstable before the plague hit. The social collapse has eliminated the normal support systems that kept these individuals functioning in society, and the religious movements provide new communities that accept their eccentricities as signs of divine favor rather than mental illness. It's like the plague has created conditions where being crazy is actually an advantage, because crazy people are more willing to try extreme solutions that sane people recognize as useless or dangerous. Rich versus poor, a medieval class warfare case study. You're about to discover that even during a civilization-ending plague, the wealthy and poor don't die equally, and the ways they try to survive reveal everything ugly about medieval social structures amplified to grotesque proportions. The Black Death might be called the Great Equalizer, but equality is relative when some people start with castles and others start with dirt floors. Death may come for everyone eventually, but it's much more polite to people who can afford good accommodations. The wealthy neighborhoods of the city look like a completely different apocalypse from the poor areas, as if rich and poor people are experiencing parallel disasters that occasionally intersect at street corners. Rich families have barricaded themselves inside their stone mansions with months' worth of stored food, wine cellars that could sustain small armies, and private wells that haven't been contaminated by street runoff filled with corpses. They've essentially created luxury bunkers, complete with hired guards to keep desperate survivors from breaking in. It's like medieval preppers, except instead of worrying about government collapse, they're dealing with actual civilization collapse, and their preparations are actually working. These wealthy families employ what amounts to a medieval version of social distancing on steroids, using their resources to create protective bubbles that poor people could never afford. They've dismissed all their servants except for a few trusted retainers who live on the premises and aren't allowed to leave, creating isolated household communities. Food is delivered to outer courtyards by merchants who aren't permitted inside the main house, with payment left in containers that are retrieved after the merchants have gone. Communication with the outside world happens through messengers who shout information from the street, while household members listen from upper-story windows. It's quarantined with the financial resources to make it actually work. But here's where wealth becomes a double-edged sword that can cut both ways. Rich people have more to lose, which makes them targets for increasingly desperate survivors who figure that wealthy folks won't miss a few luxuries. You witness a scene where a mob of starving townspeople has surrounded a wealthy merchant's house, demanding that he share his food stores with the community. The merchant's guards are outnumbered 10 to 1, but the mob doesn't have weapons or organization. It's a tense standoff that could go either way, because while wealth provides resources for defense, it also provides motivation for attack. The merchant knows that if he gives in to demands, he'll be seen as an easy target for future raids. The poor, meanwhile, are dying in ways that would make medieval horror writers uncomfortable with their own work. Entire families crowded into single-room hovels where one plague infection means everyone dies within days, because there's no space for isolation and no resources for medical care. These people don't have the luxury of social distancing or quarantine. They're living on top of each other in conditions that were already unsanitary before the plague hit. When someone gets sick, there's nowhere to put them, no resources to care for them, and no way to prevent the disease from spreading to everyone else in the household. Poverty makes every aspect of plague survival more difficult and more deadly. You notice that wealthy plague victims get elaborate funeral ceremonies and expensive burial arrangements, while poor victims get thrown into mass graves called plague pits, enormous holes in the ground where bodies are stacked like cordwood and covered with lime to speed decomposition. Rich people get individual graves with headstones and prayers. Poor people get anonymity in death, just like they had in life. Even dying from the same disease becomes a class-differentiated experience. Wealthy families can afford to have priests perform last rites and proper burial ceremonies, while poor families are lucky if their loved ones get tossed into a mass grave instead of being left to rot in the streets. The most disturbing aspect is how wealth affects access to medical care, such as it is in medieval times. Rich families can afford private physicians who will actually visit their homes, while poor people have to seek care at overwhelmed public facilities that are essentially death factories. But this creates a weird situation where wealthy people are actually more likely to receive harmful medical treatments, because they can afford more bloodletting, more toxic medicines, and more dangerous surgical procedures. Sometimes being too poor for medical care is accidentally life-saving, because you avoid treatments that are worse than the disease. Employment relationships have become completely warped by plague. Dynamics in ways that reveal how market forces work when the market includes a high probability of death. Wealthy families are desperately trying to hire new servants to replace dead ones, That they're competing for a shrinking pool of healthy workers while offering wages that need to account for the high probability of death on the job. It's like hazard pay cranked up to medieval extremes. Some servants are earning more in a week than they previously made in a year, but they're also exponentially more likely to die before they can spend it. The wealthy are discovering that money can't buy safety when the entire economic system is collapsing. You observe a fascinating phenomenon among wealthy women who are using their resources to create women-only survival communities that represent perhaps the most innovative response to plague conditions. They're pooling their money to rent entire buildings, hiring female guards and servants, and essentially creating gender-segregated safe zones. This isn't just about plague survival. It's about avoiding the sexual violence that's become epidemic in lawless plague cities. Wealth provides the option of buying safety that poor women simply don't have. These women-only communities are more successful at surviving the plague, partly because they're better organized and partly because they're not dealing with the additional threat of male violence. The psychological impact of wealth during the plague creates some truly bizarre behaviors that reveal how people react when their normal sources of identity and power become meaningless. Rich people who've never experienced material once suddenly find themselves hoarding resources obsessively, even when they have more than they could possibly use. They're counting gold coins and inventory supplies compulsively, because when you've built your identity around wealth, the possibility of losing it becomes more terrifying than death itself. You see wealthy merchants sleeping on beds made of grain sacks, literally surrounding themselves with food like dragons guarding treasure. Perhaps most telling is how class differences affect attitudes toward other survivors, creating social divisions that prevent cooperation exactly when cooperation would be most beneficial for everyone's survival. Wealthy people tend to view poor plague victims as inherently more dangerous and morally suspect. They assume that poverty makes people more likely to carry disease and more likely to commit crimes. Poor people, meanwhile, increasingly view wealthy survivors as hoarding resources that should be shared in a community crisis. Both perspectives have some truth to them, but they're creating a social divide that makes mutual aid impossible where mutual aid could help everyone survive. The irony is that wealth, which normally provides security and comfort, becomes a liability in plague conditions because it makes you a target while providing limited actual protection against disease. Rich people can buy better food and housing, but they can't buy immunity from plague, and their wealth makes them targets for violence from desperate survivors. Poor people have fewer resources, but also fewer expectations to lose, and they're more accustomed to hardship and uncertainty. In some ways, poverty provides better psychological preparation for plague survival than wealth does. The industrial logistics of mass death. You've been wondering where all the bodies go, and now you're about to get a masterclass in medieval death management during a crisis that makes modern funeral directors look like they're handling a light workload at a retirement community. The system's designed to deal with normal death rates. Maybe a dozen people per week in a city this size are now facing hundreds of deaths per day. And the results are exactly as horrific as you'd expect when infrastructure designed for routine mortality encounters industrial-scale death. The traditional burial process has completely collapsed under the sheer volume of corpses that need processing. Normally, families would prepare their dead with proper washing and shrouding, hold wake ceremonies where friends and relatives could pay respects, conduct religious services that provided spiritual comfort, and bury their loved ones in individual graves with appropriate markers and ongoing memorial care. This entire system was designed for a world where death was infrequent enough to treat each case individually, with proper attention to religious requirements and family needs. When people are dying faster than they can be buried, individual treatment becomes impossible, and you end up with industrial-scale death processing that's more logistics than ceremony. The city has organized teams of body collectors who make rounds through the streets like a macabre version of garbage pickup. Except garbage doesn't smell this bad and doesn't used to be someone's family member. These crews consist of whoever is desperate enough to take a job that involves handling plague corpses all day, usually the poorest survivors, who need the money badly enough to accept what amounts to a death sentence job with unusually high pay. They use carts, wheelbarrows, and sometimes just drag bodies by the arms or legs to collection points. It's brutal, undignified work that treats human remains like refuse. But it's also absolutely necessary to prevent even worse sanitary conditions that would make the current horror show look manageable. You follow one of these collection teams and witness the systematic dehumanization that mass death requires for psychological survival. The workers have stopped seeing corpses as former people with names and families and stories. They're just objects to be moved efficiently from point A to point B. They've developed techniques for stacking bodies to maximize cart capacity, methods for handling decomposed remains that won't fall apart during transport, and strategies for working quickly enough to avoid prolonged exposure to disease while still completing their quotas. It's like watching factory workers, except the factory produces death instead of goods. And the workers know they're probably going to become products themselves within a few weeks. The burial sites themselves are unlike anything in normal human experience, representing a complete abandonment of traditional concepts about proper treatment of the dead. Instead of individual graves with personal markers and religious significance, the city has dug enormous trenches called plague pits, holes in the ground large enough to hold hundreds of bodies at once. Workers arrange corpses in layers like macabre lasagna, sprinkling lime between each layer to accelerate decomposition and reduce smell. It's efficient, practical, and completely horrifying. These mass graves will eventually become public health hazards when groundwater gets contaminated. But that's tomorrow's problem for tomorrow's survivors. Religious burial rites have been simplified to the point of becoming almost meaningless, which creates spiritual crisis for families who believe proper burial ceremonies are necessary for salvation. Priests who are still alive and willing to work perform abbreviated ceremonies for groups of dead rather than individuals. Instead of personalized prayers and specific religious observances tailored to the deceased's life and spiritual needs, you get assembly line salvation, generic blessings pronounced over cartloads of corpses. It's theologically questionable and emotionally devastating for families. But it's the only way to provide any religious service at all when the death rate exceeds the church's capacity to handle individual cases. The economics of death have become completely surreal in ways that would fascinate economists if they weren't too busy being dead or fleeing plague cities. Coffins, which were already expensive luxuries that most people couldn't afford even in normal times, are now impossible to obtain at any price because there's no wood available and no carpenters alive to build them. The few remaining woodworkers are charging prices that would buy a house in normal times. Assuming you can find someone willing to take payment in currency rather than food or protection, burial shrouds made from proper linen have given way to whatever fabric can be scavenged. Old clothes, bed sheets, table coverings, sometimes just wrapping bodies in their own garments. It's like the entire funeral industry reverted to prehistoric practices overnight. Body disposal has created a labor market unlike anything in economic history, where supply and demand curves look like they were drawn by someone having a particularly dark nightmare. The people willing to handle corpses can essentially name their price, because demand vastly exceeds supply, and the work is so dangerous that most people would literally rather starve than take these jobs. But the pay is meaningless if you die within a week of starting work, which creates this bizarre situation where the most lucrative employment in the city is also the most likely to kill you. It's like hazard pay calculated for jobs where the hazard is almost certain death. You notice that families have developed their own strategies for dealing with dead relatives when official body collection is too slow or unavailable, leading to improvised death management that would horrify public health officials. Some people are throwing corpses out of windows into the streets, treating their own family members like garbage because keeping a decomposing body inside a small house becomes unbearable after a few days. Others are burning bodies in courtyards or back gardens, creating informal crematoriums that fill neighborhoods with smoke and the smell of burning flesh. These private disposal methods create additional health hazards but represent desperate attempts to maintain some dignity in death when official systems have collapsed. The psychological impact on the body collection workers is devastating to witness, representing perhaps the most extreme example of occupational trauma in human history. These people see more death in a single day than most humans see in a lifetime, handling corpses that include friends, neighbors, and sometimes their own family members. They develop a kind of emotional numbness that's necessary for psychological survival, but also makes them seem almost inhuman to other survivors. It's like watching people transform themselves into efficient death processing machines to cope with an impossible job that will probably kill them. Record keeping has become completely impossible, which means that entire family lines are disappearing without any record of their existence or passing. Normally, deaths would be recorded in church registers with names, dates, causes of death, and burial locations, creating a historical record that families could use for inheritance and memorial purposes. Now, bodies are being disposed of faster than they can be identified, let alone documented. Entire families are disappearing without any record of their existence, as if the plague isn't just killing people, it's erasing them from history as if they never existed at all. This creates additional problems for property inheritance and family identification that will persist long after the plague ends. Superstition, scapegoats, and medieval conspiracy theories. You've probably noticed by now that when people don't understand what's happening to them, they start inventing explanations that range from creative to completely insane. And medieval people, during the Black Death, have taken this human tendency to levels that make modern internet conspiracy theories look like peer-reviewed science. FIC research. The plague has turned medieval society into a breeding ground for supernatural explanations, elaborate conspiracy theories, and systematic scapegoating that makes modern misinformation look like rational discourse conducted by sober-minded academics. The most popular explanation for the plague among educated people is astrological, specifically that a rare conjunction of planets in 1345 corrupted the air and caused disease. This theory came from actual university-trained physicians and astronomers, which shows how even educated people can create elaborate, pseudoscientific explanations when they don't have access to actual scientific knowledge or methodology. People are studying star charts obsessively, trying to predict when the planetary alignment will return to normal and the plague will end. They're paying astronomers enormous sums to create personalized horoscopes that will protect them from plague influence. It's like medieval people trying to solve a biological crisis, using space-based weather predictions combined with personalized cosmic medicine. But astrology is the respectable explanation that sophisticated people discuss at dinner parties. The street-level theories get much darker and more dangerous, leading to systematic violence against groups blamed for causing the plague. Many people believe the plague is caused by Jews poisoning wells and water sources, a conspiracy theory that has led to systematic massacres across Europe where entire Jewish communities are being burned alive by mobs convinced that killing Jews will stop the plague. The irony is that Jewish communities often had lower plague death rates because of better hygiene practices and dietary laws that accidentally provided some protection. But this lower death rate is being used as evidence of their guilt rather than proof of their innocence. You witness a witch trial where a woman is accused of causing plague deaths through supernatural means, and the evidence against her would be laughable if it weren't leading to her torture and execution. The charges include: she owned a black cat. She knew herbal remedies that actually help people feel better. She was seen talking to herself, probably prayer. Someone had a bad dream about her, and she lived alone without male protection. This passes for legal evidence in a society where supernatural causation is considered more plausible than natural disease transmission. The woman will be tortured until she confesses to practicing witchcraft, then executed publicly as a warning to other suspected witches. Because medieval justice assumes that if you torture someone long enough, they'll tell you the truth. Some communities have decided that the plague is punishment for specific sins, leading to organized persecutions of groups considered morally problematic by medieval standards. Prostitutes, homosexuals, gamblers, usurers, and anyone who charges interest on loans are being driven out of cities or killed outright by mobs, convinced that removing sinful people will convince God to end the plague. It's like medieval cancel culture, except instead of social media shaming, they use actual murder as enforcement mechanism. These purges are often led by religious authorities, who see the plague as an opportunity to enforce moral standards that were difficult to maintain in normal times. The flagellant movements you encountered earlier have developed their own conspiracy theories about who's preventing their prayers from working, because obviously if God isn't responding to their self-torture, someone must be sabotaging their efforts. They blame local authorities for not being sufficiently supportive of self-flagellation, church officials for being too corrupt to deserve divine intervention, and foreign countries for sending plague demons across borders through trade routes. When reality contradicts your beliefs, it's easier to assume that someone is sabotaging your efforts than to question whether your beliefs might be wrong in the first place. You observe a fascinating phenomenon called plague dancing, where entire communities become convinced that the plague is caused by demonic possession that can be cured through collective dancing that will literally shake the demons out of infected bodies. These aren't celebrations. They're desperate exorcism attempts where hundreds of people dance frantically for days until they collapse from exhaustion, dehydration, or heart failure. The dancing spreads from town to town like a psychological contagion, and people who refuse to participate are accused of being possessed by plague demons or of being witches who are preventing the dancing cure from working. Animal scapegoating has reached medieval levels of absurdity that will be funny if it weren't making the plague worse. Dogs and cats are being killed en masse because they're suspected of carrying plague demons or being supernatural messengers of death sent by Satan to spread disease. This is actually making the plague worse because cats normally control rat populations, and rats carry the fleas that actually spread plague. The medieval people don't know about bacteria or disease vectors, so they're eliminating the animals that might have helped while pursuing supernatural explanations that guarantee failure. Medical misinformation is spreading faster than the plague itself, creating a parallel epidemic of dangerous treatments and fraudulent cures. Traveling physicians are selling miracle cures made from everything from ground unicorn horn to powdered mummy remains to pulverized pearls dissolved in wine. People are paying enormous sums for treatments that range from useless to actively harmful, because desperate people will believe anything that offers hope. It's like medieval people are getting scammed by snake oil salesmen during a medical emergency. Except the snake oil sometimes contains actual poison that kills people faster than the plague would have. The most disturbing scapegoating involves children, who are being accused of causing the plague through unspecified sins or supernatural activities that supposedly anger God. Child witch trials are becoming common, with youngsters tortured into confessing that they've made deals with devils or cast curses on their communities. Children as young as 8 are being executed for supposedly causing plague deaths through magical means. It's a level of victim blaming that defies rational explanation, where a society's complete helplessness gets channeled into violence against its most vulnerable members. Perhaps most telling is how these conspiracy theories provide psychological comfort by offering simple explanations and clear villains for an incomprehensible catastrophe that threatens everything people understand about how the world works. It's easier to believe that Jews are poisoning wells than to accept that diseases can spread randomly and kill arbitrarily without regard for morality or social status. It's more satisfying to burn a witch than to admit that you're powerless against natural forces that don't care about human prayers or punishments. These explanations don't work, but they make people feel like they're doing something meaningful instead of just helplessly watching their world collapse around them while they wait for their own turn to die. The long dark night of the medieval soul, you've been in this plague city for what feels like an eternity, and now you're experiencing what medieval people called the dark night of the soul. Except, it's not just a spiritual metaphor from mystical literature. It's a literal description of what it feels like to watch civilization collapse in real time while your own survival remains a doyle. Why coin flip with death? This is the psychological reality of living through an apocalypse that isn't dramatic or heroic like in movies, just relentlessly, grinding, soul-crushingly horrific in ways that make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature and the meaning of existence. The first thing that breaks down is your sense of time, which becomes this strange, elastic concept that stretches and contracts in ways that would fascinate philosophers if they weren't too busy being dead or fleeing plague cities. When every day could be your last, and when the normal rhythms of life, work schedules, social gatherings, seasonal celebrations, religious festivals have completely disappeared. Time stops functioning as a reliable framework for organizing experience. Hours crawl by with agonizing slowness when you're watching someone die, but weeks seem to vanish without notice because every day is identical in its horror. You stop thinking about future plans because planning assumes survival, and survival is no longer something you can take for granted. Sleep becomes this weird negotiation between exhaustion and terror that would make sleep disorder specialists weep with professional frustration. You're physically drained from the constant stress and the physical demands of survival, finding food, avoiding disease, staying alert for threats from other survivors, but you're also afraid to close your eyes because unconsciousness means vulnerability. People develop sleeping strategies that would sound paranoid in normal times, but make perfect sense in plague conditions. Sleeping in shifts with trusted companions, barricading doors with furniture, keeping weapons within reach, choosing sleep locations based on escape routes rather than comfort. Sleep deprivation becomes chronic, which affects judgment and emotional stability, creating a downward spiral of poor decisions and psychological deterioration. Your relationship with your own body changes in ways that are difficult to describe to people who haven't experienced constant proximity to death. Every minor symptom becomes potentially catastrophic. A headache could be early-stage plague. A cough could mean your death sentence. Fatigue could indicate that your body is starting to shut down. You become hyper-aware of every sensation while simultaneously trying to ignore physical discomfort, because acknowledging pain might mean acknowledging mortality. It's like living with constant hypochondria, except the disease you're afraid of actually is everywhere and actually will kill you if you catch it. Your body stops feeling like something you inhabit and starts feeling like something that might betray you at any moment. The psychological impact of constant death exposure creates a kind of emotional numbness that's necessary for survival, but terrifying in its completeness. You've stopped reacting to individual corpses, stopped feeling sympathy for specific suffering, stopped experiencing grief for particular losses. It's like your brain has developed calluses against human tragedy, which keeps you functional but also makes you question whether you're still fully human. When watching children die doesn't make you cry anymore. When seeing families destroyed doesn't produce emotional response. When corpses become obstacles rather than reminders of mortality, you know something fundamental has changed about who you are as a person. Relationships with other survivors become intensely complicated because everyone is simultaneously a potential ally and a potential threat, creating social dynamics that are exhausting and paranoid. You need other people for practical survival, sharing resources, providing protection, maintaining some semblance of human connection. But you also can't trust anyone completely because desperation makes people unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. Every interaction involves calculating whether this person is more likely to help you or hurt you. And those calculations can change rapidly as circumstances evolve. Friendships become transactional. Romantic relationships become survival partnerships. And family bonds get tested by resource scarcity and conflicting survival strategies. The collapse of normal social structures creates this weird psychological freedom that's both liberating and terrifying in equal measure. Class distinctions that seemed permanent and natural before the plague now seem arbitrary and meaningless, when everyone's equally likely to die regardless of birth or wealth. Religious authority that once provided moral guidance has fractured into competing interpretations that contradict each other and offer conflicting advice about how to achieve salvation. Legal systems that once defined acceptable behavior have essentially disappeared, leaving people to create their own moral frameworks. You can do things that would have been unthinkable before the plague, but you also have no clear guidelines for what's right or wrong in these unprecedented circumstances. Memory becomes unreliable in ways that are deeply disturbing and suggest that trauma affects cognitive function in unexpected ways. You find yourself forgetting what life was like before the plague, even though it was just months ago. Normal activities like market days, religious festivals, family gatherings start to seem like things you might have imagined rather than actual experiences you lived through. The contrast between normal life and plague life is so extreme that your brain can't hold both realities simultaneously, so it starts discarding memories that don't fit current circumstances. It's like the plague isn't just destroying the present and future, it's retroactively erasing the past, making it impossible to believe that normal life ever existed. Perhaps most devastating is the loss of meaning and purpose that comes with watching everything you once cared about become irrelevant or impossible to maintain. Professional skills that took years to develop are now useless because the economic systems that valued them have collapsed. Personal relationships that defined your identity have been severed by death or separation. Goals and ambitions that motivated your daily life now seem absurdly trivial compared to the simple objective of staying alive for another day. Religious beliefs that provided spiritual comfort are challenged by evidence that prayers don't prevent plague, and good people die just as easily as bad people. You're experiencing the complete breakdown of everything that gave life meaning, and rebuilding meaning from scratch in a world that seems designed to crush hope. The final psychological horror is the realization that this is your new normal, that there's no going back to the world that existed before the plague, even if you somehow survive the current crisis. Even if the plague eventually ends, even if some version of normal life eventually resumes, too much has been destroyed, and too much has changed for life to ever return to what it was. The social structures, economic systems, religious institutions, and cultural practices that defined medieval civilization have been fundamentally altered by mass death and social collapse. You're not just living through a temporary crisis. You're witnessing the end of an entire way of life. And whatever emerges afterward will be built from the ruins of everything you once knew. This is the true nightmare of the Black Death. Not just that it killed 1/3 of Europe's population, but that it psychologically destroyed the survivors by showing them that everything they believed about safety, meaning social order and human nature, was fundamentally wrong or inadequate for dealing with extreme circumstances. You wouldn't last a day in a medieval plague city, not just because of the physical dangers, the disease, the violence, the starvation, but because the psychological reality would break your mind long before the disease could break your body. The plague didn't just kill people. It killed the medieval world itself, forcing survivors to build new forms of civilization from the psychological and social wreckage of everything that came before. Closing, you've spent these hours with me walking through what was arguably humanity's darkest chapter. And I hope it's given you some perspective on just how fragile our modern comforts really are. The next time someone complains about wearing a mask or getting a vaccine, maybe you'll remember what it was like when people literally whipped themselves bloody in the streets. begging God to end the plague they couldn't understand or control. The Black Death wasn't just a medical catastrophe. It was a complete civilizational collapse that rewrote everything Europeans thought they knew about life, death, society, and human nature. It killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people in just a few years, which means that if you had lived through it, you would have watched 1 out of every 3 people you knew simply disappear from existence. But here's what's really worth remembering. Humanity survived it. Not just physically, but culturally and psychologically. The people who lived through the plague rebuilt their societies, developed better medical knowledge, created new forms of art and literature, and eventually built the foundation for the modern world we live in today. They didn't have antibiotics or epidemiologists or global health organizations, but they had something that carried them through the darkest period in human history: the stubborn refusal to give up hope even when hope seemed completely irrational. So the next time you're having a particularly difficult day, remember that your ancestors survived literal hell on Earth, and they did it without indoor plumbing or electric lights or any of the 1,000 conveniences that make your worst day better than their best day. You're descended from people who stared into the abyss and decided to keep going anyway. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, diving into history's deepest shadows. If you found this journey worthwhile, that like button is always appreciated. And I'd love to hear in the comments about which aspect of medieval plague life surprised or horrified you the most. Until next time, sleep well, and remember how bad tomorrow seems. At least you don't live in a world where the mortality rate for a common disease is 30%, and the best medical advice is to drill holes in your skull. Sweet dreams, everyone.